Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your being here. We're going to talk about hearing privilege and violence and the relationship between the two. But before I get going, I want to ask the group a question. I want to take a poll right now. How many of you have already met a person who is deaf, hard of hearing? How many of you have met someone who is deaf or hard of hearing before? Okay. Seems most of you have already met someone, but now I have a follow-up question. How many of you have worked with a deaf or hard of hearing person internally in the agency that you work for? Okay, that's great. It seems like about half of you have worked with someone who is deaf and hard of hearing, and half of you have not. So that's really good. I hope that today you're going to learn a lot from the stories that we share in the presentation that we're doing today. So what does it mean to be deaf? Often people think that being deaf means that you can't communicate, you can't work, that all these things that you can't do, but actually the only thing that it means you can't do is hear. That's the one and only thing. The word deaf has so many different meanings and definitions. It means you can't hear, but it also could be quite a wide range. Not all deaf people are the same. Some deaf people can't hear anything at all, and some have quite a bit of ability to hear. We have a lot of different people that we would include in our deaf community. And the first one I want to talk about is a capital D deaf person. This is a member of the deaf community that identifies as deaf, that uses ASL, interacts heavily with other deaf people in the community, and we call that person a capital D deaf person. Then we move over and we have a lowercase deaf person, lowercase d, and that's a person who can't hear. We don't necessarily quantify how much they can or can't hear, but it's just a person who cannot hear. Then we move over into the hard of hearing category, and that label is used more for people who function primarily as a person who can hear, but they probably miss a lot of things. They probably struggle to hear on the phone. They're missing a lot of information that comes in via sound. Sometimes it's a particular high or lower frequency, so that's a hard of hearing person. And there are some people who are hard of hearing that might know sign language. They might have grown up and attended a program with other people who are deaf and hard of hearing who sign, so they may be comfortable with that. But they tend to function in the world of people who can hear. They may be able to go back and forth, but they're primarily functioning in the hearing world. A late deafened person is someone who can hear, grew up hearing. They probably remember being able to hear and they understand sound and words, but then they lose their hearing. So it could be a process that happens over time and slowly, like that which happens to a lot of senior citizens. Or it could be other people who had an accident or a medical issue, a car accident, any number of things that could happen where they might lose their hearing overnight or within a matter of a few days. And either way, however they are late deafened, it's a process that they have to go through. Now, I myself have never been able to hear. I was born deaf, and it's the only thing that I know. But those who are late deafened have to go through a grieving process. That sometimes they go through the process of denial and all the steps that go with grieving. And they finally come to the recognition that they can't hear, and they have to figure out how they're going to access the hearing world. And there could be different ways that that happens. They may learn sign. They may continue to function as a person who can hear, but they're going to use more technology to assist them. For example, a hearing aid, a cochlear implant, or all the different kinds of technology available to us. Or they might do nothing at all. They might start screaming, talking louder at people, being kind of unaware of how loud they are because they can't hear themselves. So there's a variety of ways that people go through this process, but that's a different way than those of us who are deaf, born deaf function. But sometimes they can be our best ally in the community because they know what we're missing. For example, if I'm on an airplane and the pilot starts making announcements, I might not be aware until someone tells me that there are announcements being made, but we need access. I need access to what the pilot is saying on the plane. And the person who grew up with the ability to hear knows that. They're expecting an announcement. And so they might be the first one to say, hey, we need access to that, because they've gotten used to having that access. So they can really help us to understand where we who are born deaf need access. And then the last word that you see is deaf-blind. That is really a unique group of people because obviously they're not only deaf, they're blind as well. And it's not just as simple as combining a person who is deaf with a person who is blind. They're really their own category, and it's a whole different world. So we're not going to go into that deeply today. We're going to focus on the other areas. If you are curious about deaf-blind people and need or want more information, perhaps you're working with someone in your program who is deaf-blind, I strongly encourage you to reach out to us and we can help connect you to the appropriate resources. Now you see 3 words on your screen, 3 bullet points. Those 3 words, please do not use them. Please don't ever use them. They're offensive to people who are deaf. They're offensive to the deaf community. The word hearing impaired, think about that. What does that mean? It sounds like someone who is not able to function, who is not able to do things, and that is certainly not true. Remember, I said that the only thing that we can't do successfully is hear. We can communicate, we can interact with the world, we can do many things that people who can hear can do. Now, the way that we do those things might be a little bit different than those of you who can hear, but we can do them. Deaf and dumb and deaf mute, those are, you're really going to offend deaf people if you use those words. They're quite antiquated. It really implies that deaf people are not intelligent. Some people think that if you can't speak, you don't have the capability to do many other things, to lead and teach, and that certainly is not true, and that's not something that we want to people to think. You might hear people saying, they might identify a deaf person, might say, I'm hearing impaired or I'm deaf and dumb, but that's not an appropriate word, so don't follow their use. It could be that they were brought up in a world that taught them those inappropriate titles for labeling who they are. You know, people who are marginalized are often influenced by society and they take on the vocabulary of the oppressors, but really that's a word that you should not use. If you would like to be politically correct, I encourage you not to use that. But the appropriate terms to use are either deaf or hard of hearing. Those are the words that we use within the community that are acceptable. So as I go forward today, I'm going to use the word deaf, but I want you to know that applies to deaf, late deafened, all those categories that I went through, because we all experience similar barriers. Now, some parts of my presentation, I may use language that applies only to those people who are labeled deaf who sign, but I would say that there are still similar barriers even for people who do not sign. So there are a variety of different ways that deaf people communicate. Sometimes when we need to communicate with a person who can hear, we write. Sometimes someone needs an answer right away, and so we might write or text each other. I might need something very quickly, and I want to communicate something in the moment, so I might text on my phone. Sometimes if I text to a person, they will text back to me. They'll sort of copy the mode of communication that I'm using. I want to prevent people from thinking automatically that I can lip read, so I often will pull out my phone and text so that they understand that that is the way that I prefer to communicate as opposed to lip reading. Copy back whatever that person, if they're And if a deaf person is using a particular mode of communication with you, I encourage you to copy back whatever mode they are using, because that is their preferred way to communicate. You know, we're working in 2 languages, so we have to make sure the message is equivalent. So if you see the interpreters speaking, or hear the interpreter speaking while I am not signing, we're just clarifying what the message is. So the second one here that you see on the screen is lip reading, and that is quite a challenge for deaf people. Lip reading is not an easy thing to do. Oftentimes, people who can hear think that it's a very easy skill to acquire, but I'm here to tell you that is not at all true. There are a lot of words that look the same or similar on the lips. Movements on the lips look quite similar, and I'm sure that some of you have heard that if you speak the words "I love you," it actually looks like olive juice on the lips. Or if you haven't heard that, you can practice. So sometimes a deaf person, where deaf people are teasing each other, they'll say, "I didn't say I love you, I said olive juice." That's kind of a little inside joke in the deaf community. But if you think about lip reading, there are many words that look exactly the same on the lips. And the reason for that is that only 30% of sounds that are produced in a person's mouth show up on the lips. Much of the sound produced happens in the back of the throat, the vocal cords, perhaps in the tongue, which is hidden. It all happens inside, and you really can't see all those sounds that are being made. So what you can actually see on the lips is only about 30% of what is visible. So if you take a word like the word queen, I mean, it could be weak if you look at it on the lips. It could be weed. It could be so many different words. Green. I mean, we could go over any number of words that the word queen looks like on the lips. Now, if you have it in a sentence and you see the word in a sentence, you might be able to catch other words that help you, but you're probably only going to catch 30% of the sentence. So if you have a word that is sentence that is 10 words long, you might only catch 3 of those words. So then you're left to figure out what the rest of the sentence is, to fill in the gaps and to figure out what is being said. So think about that. And then you're only really hoping that you catch 3 words. So one of those words might be the, another might be at, and then maybe you think, oh my God, what is being talked about? You're trying to figure out the rest of these words. Are they talking about a book? And then you are easily lost. You're very quickly lost. So as a deaf person, I really try my best to catch words in a sentence that relate to the context and the content of the sentence, which can help me to understand. But the point I want to make is that lip reading, if you depend on lip reading, there can be many misunderstandings that will happen. Now, what you'll notice is a lot of deaf people, when you're talking, they'll nod their head, they'll look right at you, they'll look like they understand. But even if they do that, ask a question so that you can be sure that they really are understanding, because it's very easy and tempting for us to nod our head as if we're getting it. And often it could be that I got some of it, but I'm trying to figure out a word from a few sentences ago. So I keep nodding my head, but in the back of my head, my brain is working furiously to try and figure out what it is that you said. So as you can understand, it's not the best way to communicate with deaf people. Now, there are people that rely on speech reading. They might be more hard of hearing. They might be able to use their hearing in addition to what is presented visually on the lips. Sometimes they use lip reading as a way of supporting their hearing, and that's fine for them. But if they're in a situation where they don't understand things, or if you're in a situation where you need people to understand things, sometimes a deaf person will grab a buddy to help them understand in a situation. It could be a sibling that they pick. It could be a spouse, a friend, a coworker. It will just depend on where they are and what the situation is in terms of who they will pick. And that person will often know the communication skills of the deaf person they're with, that buddy, and they'll know that if they miss a word, they'll know which words they need to help them to understand, and they'll feed them information from the environment. So the deaf person has a buddy there with them. Now, I myself, if I go to visit my family, I really depend on my sister as my buddy. You'll never find me at a family gathering without my sister. I am always right there with her. She's right at my side. And I'm working hard to try and understand what the conversation is, and she's there to be my buddy. I mean, imagine being at the dinner table at a holiday, let's say Thanksgiving, birthday party, whatever it is, and there's all this talk and chatter going on, right? There's not only one conversation at a time. So you're looking from mouth to mouth, face to face, trying to understand what's going on. The pace is fast. And remember, we said you only get 30% of a sentence from lip reading. Sometimes the subject matter can change in a flash. And there are times when I catch part of a sentence and I think, how the heck did we go from this topic to that topic? I don't understand what the connecting sentence was. And then my buddy will fill me in and let me know. So as I said, that's what my sister tends to do for me. She's my buddy, and she'll summarize how it is that we got from one point to another. She knows my communication strengths and weaknesses with lip reading, so she's the perfect person to be my buddy. So different ways that people communicate in the hearing community is one thing, but in the deaf community, we tend to use American Sign Language, or ASL. There's a lot of historical information that I could give you about American Sign Language, and I love this part of talking about the topic of deaf people, but I'm going to really summarize it and convey to you only what relates to the oppression of deaf people, how it relates to communication. So there was a little girl named Alice a long time ago. She was back in the 1800s, and she was small. She was in her teens, and she had no education. And she couldn't communicate. She couldn't lip read very well. Teachers would write on the board, and she would not be able to see what was going on. So she didn't have a very good education growing up. And she was pretty much on her own until a man named Thomas Gallaudet met with her. And he thought that he noticed this girl wasn't socializing with other children, other teens, and wondered why, and talked with her and found out that she was deaf. So they began a conversation, and Thomas Gallaudet really started to wonder about how this young woman would be educated. Now, Alice lived with her father, and so Thomas went and talked with her father, who communicated frustration about the fact that there was no education for Alice. They had no option but to put her in a regular school where she couldn't make sense of most of what was being taught. And so Thomas Gallaudet started to wonder about how children were educated in Europe, deaf children. He ended up going to Europe, and he first arrived in London, where he was not allowed to enter the school for the deaf there. So he moved on to another country, and the country he went to was France. He was allowed into the school, and he saw deaf children signing with each other and with their teachers. And this made quite an impact on him because he saw that all the teachers there were deaf and could sign. And so he asked if he could borrow one of the teachers, and that person's name was Laurent Claire. And so the two of them took the long trip back to America. Now remember, this was the early 1800s, so this would have been a couple months long boat trip. And they decided to teach each other's language. Claire was using French Sign Language and Gallaudet was using spoken English. So they taught each other their respective languages, and Claire learned written English, and Claire taught Gallaudet French Sign Language. So by the time they arrived in America, they were able to set up the first school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. And that school still is there today, functional, still running, teaching deaf children. So it's been over 200 years that the language first arrived on this shore and started spreading. So sign really comes from French Sign Language plus deaf children and adults who had already been here that were using their own kind of sign, their own home sign, and that became what we know as American Sign Language today.
So over time, since that school was established, other deaf schools were established in the United States, including Gallaudet University, where they use sign language for college students. And I believe it was in 1864 when Gallaudet University was established. And then in the year 1880, there was a large conference in Milan in Italy. And the conference was made up of mostly hearing people, about 158, 59 hearing folks, and only one or two deaf educators. And they were talking about the best way to teach and educate deaf children. So they went round and around, and they decided, again, mostly hearing people, that oralism and the oral approach was the best method. Now, again, here in America, we had an organization founded by Alexander Graham Bell. And he really believed that deaf people should not marry each other. He believed that you should teach deaf people how to speak so they can function in the hearing world and hearing society and function as a hearing in the hearing way. So the Alexander Graham Bell organization was going on. That Milan conference happened roughly around the same time. So oralism became the order of the day. So that school in Hartford, Connecticut, and other deaf schools in the country switched to the oral approach, teaching deaf children how to speak. And that had a devastating impact on the deaf community. It was really oppressive because it took away the sign language of deaf children, and they were only allowed to speak and not use their hands to sign. And that continued until about the 1950s, which after more testing of deaf children to see how they're doing academically, it was discovered that while they were testing deaf children compared to their hearing counterparts, they found that a 17-year-old deaf child, which should have had a 12th grade reading level, was not functioning at that equivalent. On average, deaf 17-year-olds were reading and writing at a 4th grade reading level and even a lower math level. So obviously something was wrong in the education system when it came to deaf children because they were far behind their peers, and this was nationwide. So the educational system was trying to figure out what is the best way to fix that, what was the best approach to educating deaf children. And they came up with different communication methods: signed exact English, signed English, cued speech, a lot of different kind of communication methods. And I'm using the word communication methods intentionally, not a language, because it was not a language. It was based on English, and they were trying to make it in a visual way. So cued speech has nothing to do with language. It's all on the mouth and hand systems to represent sounds that make words. So the sound you make while you speak, there was a system to try to cue deaf children of what syllables were being produced to actually help them figure out what was being said. So a lot of different communication methods were tried, and that was very prevalent in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. That went throughout the whole school system in the United States. And during that time, Gallaudet University kept going. They kept using sign language to educate their students. They didn't care what Alexander Graham Bell, that whole situation and that society was doing. They kept using sign language. So in the 1960s, a linguist named William Stokoe was at Gallaudet, and he was a hearing gentleman. And he was trying to figure out what the deaf community was actually using organically as far as their language, the way that they were communicating and presenting concepts to each other, and how that was different from English. Like, for example, first, second, third. In English, there's a word for that, first, second, third. But in context, in American Sign Language, it looks very differently. Like if you win a race, you sign it this way, first, second, third, like that. If I'm talking in an instructional situation like a recipe, I would use my hand like this, first, second, third. So there's different ways in how sign language is produced, different than English. So Stokoe started to suspect that there was different grammatical rules within American Sign Language that is different than English. And he started noticing these different anomalies and wondering why. And he wanted to formally research sign language. And the deaf community was very much against that. They did not want him researching their language. And the reason for that was because they were afraid that they would lose everything they had already gained with sign language. Because, I mean, again, the school system would not allow children to use American Sign Language, and they didn't want to lose what little language they had. So it was almost like an underground language for many years all over America. It was underground. People didn't talk about it. They would sign to each other in their homes or at gatherings, but it wasn't something that they did outside of their homes. They could not use it in the classroom. They would just use it to figure out, how was everyone doing and social gatherings, but it was not being done in the classroom. There was a lot of deaf clubs in that all over the United States, and they would sign at deaf clubs. When they were out with hearing folks, they would try to talk or use whatever they could to interact with the hearing world. And again, in the 60s, they were afraid that if research was done on American Sign Language, that it could have some devastating consequences. But luckily, there were a few deaf people in the community that really agreed with William Stokoe and feel like we need to research this language and have some more study behind it. And they actually did find that it was a language, that American Sign Language is a language. And again, going back to the 1800s, where we received our language from France, the French Sign Language was a different structure. So when it came to America, we received our language here from France. So our grammatical syntax is different. It more mirrors French than it does English. And back in the 1800s, we really didn't understand the implications of that. So when the Milan Conference happened in the 1880s, they decided that deaf children aren't able to write as well as their hearing counterparts, therefore sign language should not be taught. They didn't realize that there were two separate languages with two separate grammatical syntax. It took like 50 years later before they realized American Sign Language is its own language. So in the 1960s, that's when the educational system started to get pushback from Gallaudet University, saying that we need to teach children American Sign Language. And we started educating the educational system that this language has been here since the 1880s and that deaf people all over the United States use this. But because that oralism and cute speech and everything was so prevalent, it was really hard to combat that because, again, who was making the decisions for the educational system? It was government, it was hearing educators, it was that system. Deaf people weren't involved in those decision making as far as how we educate our children and the communication that we need to better enhance our lives. So today, now we're at 2018, deaf children are still at a high risk for language deprivation. School systems often decide that they know the best way to teach deaf children. The medical community says that sign language is not good for deaf children, that they should get hearing aids and cochlear implants and focus on speech alone for language acquisition. The problem with that is children don't have access to language until they're found to be deaf and hard of hearing, and that sometimes is age 1, age 2, sometimes all the way up to age 5. So those crucial developmental years, there's no language there. So how do you educate that child? And often hearing parents are told by the medical community to teach their children how to speak. So they spend all those years being taught how to speak. And that is my experience, actually. When I was growing up, I was found to be deaf at 1 year old. I had hearing aids at 1.5 years, no language up until that point. I went to speech therapy when I was 1.5. I went all the time to speech therapy. While my sisters were out playing, I was going to speech therapy. And that went on for several years. And when I started school at age 5, more speech therapy. I would be taken out of the classroom and put into speech therapy classes. So I'm missing learning whatever the other kids were learning, whether it was history, math, science. I was being pulled out constantly of my classroom to learn how to speak. And that would be at least an hour every day or an hour every couple weeks, depending on what the school system provides. So a lot of deaf children go through that. So when deaf children usually reach about the age of 10, they are found by the deaf school or by the school system to not be where their hearing counterparts are, especially with math and English. Deaf children are often really behind. So they may have abilities of a 4 or 5 year old when they're 10 years old. So at this point, the school system looks at those deaf children and thinks, well, now what do we do? You know, this child has already had language deprivation for 10 years. So at this point, they say, oh, well, let's try the deaf school, or, oh, let's try a sign language interpreter. So at the age of 10, they finally have access to a visual language and start picking that up. But again, the delays are so significant that they often don't catch up. And that's a serious problem in the deaf community because of that historical oppression, like I was talking about, all the way from the 1880s until now. So there's a lot of layers there. I have some statistics to share with you as well. And this is how bad it is for deaf children currently now in the United States because of that lack of access to language. And, you would think that, a child that doesn't receive language until they're 10 years old can't possibly happen today, but it really does. So the lack of access to information, communication is so delayed in so many of our deaf children. The ability to communicate, the ability to write. They often do not have very clear English skills because of the language deprivation. So that's what we're seeing in our deaf kids. Does anyone have any questions so far? I know I've been giving you a lot of information, so feel free to type your questions if you need to. And I think I'm going to pause for a second just to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, it seems that we're good so far. Oh, I see a question.
For what reasons?
Oh no, that's my poll question for later.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. All right, we'll just move right along here. Next, I want to talk about hearing privilege. We often talk in our work about white privilege. It's very similar. There's a lot of layers, a lot of overlap when it comes to hearing privilege. There's different areas in everyone's life where privilege occurs. A big one is access to information. As a hearing person, you often get access to information before a person who is deaf does. Like, for example, if you're in a public place and you could hear, and there's maybe a public servants announcement, that's something you have access to, whereas a person who's deaf wouldn't have. Another example would be radio. You could be in the kitchen making dinner or driving down the road and you have the radio on. You can hear the news, you can hear maybe a traffic jam up ahead. As a deaf person, I don't have access to any information while I'm driving. Like if there's some sort of natural disaster or accident up the road, like maybe I'm driving from Madison to Eau Claire, which is a 3-hour drive, and maybe there's a traffic jam or something is up the road, or maybe a school shooting or something happened during that 3 hours. I don't know anything has happened. And sometimes I'll get to places and the first thing I hear is people saying, oh, did you hear such and such? And I'm out of the loop. I don't know because I haven't had access, and I don't get access to things like radio. Another example is, how many times have you gone to a restaurant and eavesdropped to other people in the table next to you, and you kind of pick up different things? That's something, again, I don't have access to. Like, how many times you're like, oh my gosh, do you hear what they're saying? They're talking about such and such. Just access to information, news, things going on in the world. That's something I don't have access to. As a deaf person, I have to get my information directly from a source, whether it's the internet or something, another member of the community. And that's a big deal in the deaf community. We share information with each other. We're always giving each other tips on how to handle certain situations. And just through your everyday life in the grocery store, in the mall, just hearing little bits and snippets and this and that. And that's something that, as a deaf person, I don't have access to. And deaf people often don't know about resources like WCASA, Deaf Unity, and Abuse. Deaf people don't even usually know that it's there. They're just going through their life and just know that these different crises and situations are happening to them, but they don't know who to turn to. They don't know what resources are out there. So they think that maybe they should call the police, maybe they shouldn't, maybe they'll go to the hospital, maybe they won't. There's so many different barriers for deaf people to access these resources, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another term I wanted to mention was autism, and that might be a new word for you. It's not like autism. That's not what I'm talking about. It's with a D, autism. So autism obviously is a disability. That's a completely different topic, but autism is the act of oppression based on your ability to hear. It's like racism, ageism, all of the other isms that are in our society. It's oppression, again, based on the ability to not hear. So as a hearing person, I can hear, so therefore I will oppress those who cannot hear. And there's different kinds of oppression that exist in our community. There's individual and systematic oppression. Individual oppression, there's lots of different examples I could give of hearing to deaf oppression. Suppose I need to communicate with someone by, and I'll try to write back and forth with that person, whether it's a customer service representative or I need some assistance or something, so I'll write something. And while I'm writing, the hearing person just jumps to the other person in line that's behind me and takes care of them because they don't want to wait for me to write what I need. And that's for me is offensive because it's my turn. I'm here at the line. I'm engaging with you. They need to wait their turn because I need a little extra time to communicate. And it's really oppressive, and deaf people experience that all the time. And individual oppression often happens at the home as well. If there's a large hearing family with maybe one deaf member of the family and some information is missed, what often happens is the deaf person will ask the hearing family member, what did they say? And the hearing family member will say, oh, I'll tell you later. And that happens so much, and it's so prevalent. It happens in the workplace. A bunch of coworkers are sitting around laughing, and the deaf coworker says, oh, what are you laughing about? And the hearing coworker says, oh, it was just a stupid joke. I'll tell you later. So imagine seeing that over and over, day after day, year after year. All of that kind of builds up, and every once in a while, a deaf person will present as very angry because of all of that systematic individual family oppression that has built up in their lives for so many years where they haven't had access to the communication, and it's always, I'll tell you later, you don't need to know. And sometimes you may be dealing with a victim who is deaf and they just blow their top over something seemingly insignificant, and your reaction might be to tell them to calm down, that it's not a big deal. But what you have to realize is there's so much built up oppression and anger that they've experienced over the years that sometimes the littlest thing will set them off. Systematic oppression, moving on to that topic, there's several different things I could mention here, whether it's access to the court systems, access to public services, there's no interpreter, there's no captions. If you're a deaf person and need to go to court, you have to request an interpreter weeks in advance. If you want to go to a community meeting held by the police department, you have to ask for an interpreter way in advance. It's not something you can just do at the spur of the moment. And often you'll get the answer of, oh, I'm sorry, if you want this service, you're going to have to ask at least 4 weeks in advance. And as a deaf person, I'm like, I just heard about this meeting 2 days ago. How am I supposed to know that? So again, systematic oppression. And deaf people face these barriers from different systems that we have to interact with on a daily basis.
So there are many different situations that deaf people face where they feel oppressed. Now, an example that I want to give you is if a police show up at a situation, someone calls 911, the police shows up, there's a deaf person there, and the deaf person is struggling to communicate. What often happens is that the officer will go immediately to a person who can hear, get the full story, so they think, from them. And then it turns out they haven't even asked for a way to communicate with the deaf person. They haven't even asked. And then to make matters worse, they might ask the hearing person to interpret for the deaf person. Now, you don't know what's happened in that situation. The police have not had the opportunity to ask the deaf person directly what their story is. Sometimes a hearing person might omit facts, skew the story. You never know, especially if it's a situation where you have an oppressor. So the police often don't realize in that situation that the person they're using as an interpreter is actually the perpetrator. They might tell a story that makes it appear that it's the deaf person's fault or that nothing really happened, that the deaf person is inventing stories. And the reason that this is allowed is that hearing people have privilege and they're allowed to take power in the situation. They might tell the police officer they're the one that's the regular interpreter. They do everything to take control so that the deaf person has no way to communicate. They have no voice in the situation, if you will. They have no way to explain what their side of the story is. It's really sad and unfortunate. But Deaf Unity we're doing our best to try and educate both police and agencies. We strongly encourage you not to use a person in the situation who can hear as an interpreter, because you never know who that person is and if they're the perpetrator or not. You just don't know. It could be that this person that you're using as your interpreter is the person who is responsible for harming the deaf person. Now, it could be that you have two deaf people in a relationship, and one person can maybe speak a little bit, and the other person uses sign language. And sometimes the person who has more verbal language can be the oppressor of the other deaf person. It could be that the police or an advocate walks in and finds someone who has a little bit of speech. They're going to be drawn to that person because it's easier to communicate with that person. But please remember to give the person who does not use speech and spoken language allow them to have a voice. So I want to tell a story at this point about a couple that was struggling to have a baby. This is a deaf couple. They were wondering what happened, so what was going on. They went into a specialist to try and figure out why they were having trouble getting pregnant. The doctor did some tests and reviewed their file and history and found that the woman had already had a hysterectomy. Now, the deaf woman was quite perplexed by this and had no idea that this had happened and thought that this couldn't possibly be true. Nobody had ever told her she had had one. But when she stopped to think about it, she remembered a time when her parents had been an interpreter for her appointment. And she had had surgery at that time, and it was something going on with her abdomen. What she didn't realize is that a hysterectomy was done at that time. And she was never told that and had no idea. And the reason is because her parents were her interpreters, and they had told the doctor to just go ahead and do a hysterectomy because they figured she was deaf and, the chances were slim that she was ever going to marry and want to have a child. So think about the power that these hearing people had, who happened to be her parents, in this one person's life. And many people don't realize, if they're dealing with the family of a deaf person, they might think that, of course, they have their best interests at heart, but they may not realize the amount of power that these people have over the deaf person. Quite often, people tend to misunderstand a deaf person's behavior. You have to remember with trauma, reactions can be heightened, and sometimes people might seem to be going off topic, and it's very common with a deaf victim to be telling a story that seems to be going all over the place, and they might not understand what's going on. They're trying to figure out what people are talking about, who they're talking to, what's being said. There's all these layers of oppression that are happening related to a traumatic situation that they're experiencing now and that they have experienced in the past. And it could be misinterpreted as this deaf person being aggressive. So you have police or other people there who see this person with exaggerated expressions and sign language, and they might be really tempted to say, calm down, and they might even handcuff a person. Now, this is not the deaf person's fault. They don't realize what's happening in a situation, and then they're experiencing all these layers of oppression. They aren't able to make their story known and heard, if you will. So, it could be that there's a very specific thing they want to communicate, and if you had an interpreter come in that understood them, they might be able to communicate it, but that even the interpreter might misunderstand the intent of the message. It could be that there's a word that is seemingly swearing in English that in ASL doesn't have the same meaning. Our language is a very visual language, and we tend to be very direct. We don't use a lot of euphemisms or have a lot of flowery language. We tend to say it as it is. So if we want to say something is not my problem, we use this sign and give the middle finger. It doesn't mean fuck it or fuck you. It does not have that meaning at all. But an interpreter who is not familiar with the deaf community and doesn't understand the culture might think that they're swearing. Now, the deaf person might not have that intent, but they might look quite aggressive at this point. But really, all they're intending to say is, this is not my problem. Or another sign that could be literally interpreted as shit doesn't really mean that. There's lots of swear words in English that don't have that same meaning in American Sign Language. Now, many interpreters know the culture and the language and work hard to be involved and understand, but it's really hard to have the equivalent of a native speaker. Anyone who is not a native member of our community is never going to fully understand a deaf person's experience of oppression and their use of language. So in some situations, it would really be extremely beneficial to have a certified deaf interpreter. A certified deaf interpreter. That's a person who is deaf. They are part of the community. They know the language and the culture. They've experienced the oppression. They've lived this. It's an internal experience and understanding for them. And what they do is they work with a hearing interpreter to try and mitigate some of these possible problems and misunderstandings that might come up. So the deaf interpreter might inform the interpreter who can hear that although you just saw the middle finger given, they're not swearing, they're not saying F you to the people that are here, they're not being aggressive, they're just trying to tell their story in their language. They're saying they weren't part of the situation. So the system tends to, a lot of systematic courts, police systems tend to say that interpreters are very expensive, and not only can we not afford one, we can't afford two. We can't bring in a hearing interpreter and a CDI. We don't have the resources. But what I would tell you is that systems have resources, that you have funds that are there to be used, and you will see the benefit in the long run if you use your resources to have an interpreter, a certified deaf interpreter, and you bring both of them in. You'll see that communication will go much more smoothly. There'll be many fewer understandings, and you'll see the amount of time spent on interpreters lessened. And we could say much, much more about CDIs, but that's really all that we have time to go into right now. So I have a question for you in the chat box, and I want to ask that question now. Why do you think that a deaf person might not want to use our program services to receive the services that they need? Why would they not want to receive services from, why would they not want to receive services from your agency? Anyone? Do we have any responses? Any guesses?
Well,
fear, how they might be treated, not able to communicate. I'm just reading through some of the responses I see. Not sure how we are going to have our needs met. Being the only deaf person in a program, no deaf people on staff, lots of answers coming in here. No advocate that knows American Sign Language available, perhaps don't want to feel different from the peers, don't want to stand out. Fear of repercussions, fear of hidden fees, not knowing if an interpreter will be brought in, not feeling welcome. Lots going down the list here. Let's see, not feeling included. Wonderful. Yes, you are correct. These are all correct answers. A lot of it relates to fear. That's a really big one. Trauma that a deaf person has experienced, the oppression they've experienced over their life, the lack of trust. There are many, many different reasons why a deaf person may be resistant to go into your programs to ask for services, and you've named a lot of them. We try to do a lot of outreach and education to show that programs can be open, but there's still that historical trauma, and you can't erase that experience of trauma from a deaf person's brain. It could be that they are used to hearing people not helping them. They're used to hearing people oppressing them. And so why should they believe that you're going to be different? It's a big question that we ask ourselves over and over again. Is it going to be any different this time? If I walk in, one of the responses we had up here that someone said is that a deaf person doesn't want to stand out. I mean, a deaf person walks in the door, it's obvious that we are deaf and often we're the only one. And that's a really difficult thing as a deaf individual, to be brave enough to walk in, say, I have issues, I've been through these experiences of sexual assault or domestic violence, and I need your help. Another reason that someone might not walk into your resources, your agency, is they're just not aware that those resources are available to them. And that really is something that we need to work on, to educate people, to teach them what's out there, what options they have, what options deaf people have, the resources that they can make use of. Deaf Unity has been working very hard to reach out to the deaf community and let them know that there are resources out there. Not only Deaf Unity, but other programs that are similar to us that serve people who can hear. And we try to let them know that they can pick either option. They can come to Deaf Unity, or they can go to an agency that's set up mainly for hearing people and receive accommodations to make it accessible for them. We want them to understand the history of oppression, and we work with agencies as well. So we educate both the agencies that work with deaf people and the deaf community to understand what our oppression is, what our experiences are, our historical oppression, because often we within the community don't even understand these things. So thank you for all your comments that you gave and your responses. I really appreciate that, and you're on target. I want to show you some statistics now. Deaf people are 150% more likely to be victims of sexual assault, abuse, and bullying in their lifetime. The number is higher because, again, it goes back to our access to information, language, communication, and often people just think that deaf people don't understand, and so they're picked on and oppressed. And I really do have a heart for deaf children who are being picked on. Sometimes deaf children may see a deaf child with a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, and we know that children like to tease. It could be that the deaf child's voice sounds funny, if you will, and they grow up being quite used to being bullied, and so they get into other relationships and situations. And when they're bullied, they think it's normal. They don't realize that this is not behavior that they have to accept and tolerate. Domestic violence impacts 1 out of every 2 deaf women. It's higher than the general population in statistics. In the general population, it's 1 out of 4. So this is double the rate compared to hearing women who are victims of domestic violence. And again, this relates back to communication, oppression, not feeling like they can get information in the moment, having to wait to have things explained to them or understood. Could be that a hearing individual is with a deaf person and they're doing harm to the deaf person. It could be that that deaf person has experienced oppression over the years. And sometimes it could be that they project that onto their partner. So the oppression builds up. And it could be that the deaf person is the abuser to a hearing person or to whoever their partner is. Or sometimes you have a hearing partner who is doing harm to a deaf person. That's power and control over that person. Could be that they're bullying them about not understanding what is going on and being violent to them, saying that they aren't able to understand, they don't have the capability to understand what's going on. But the violence can go either way. 31% of deaf men and women experience emotional abuse. And often with a deaf person, they feel minimized because they are deaf. They feel that whatever's happening to them is happening to them because they are deaf. That's a difficult issue for many deaf people who experience that.
It's estimated that 50% of all deaf children have experienced sexual abuse before they reach adulthood. And that's a pretty scary statistic, especially in our community. Again, it goes back to communication and language access. When people don't have access to language, when they don't have access to communication, when they have limited access to communicating with their parents and people in authority, such as teachers and other trusted adults, this is the kind of statistics you see, or even with their own peers. And they feel that maybe someone who is doing the abuse to a deaf child figures that that deaf child does not have the resources to say something, and will just, if I tell them it's normal, then they'll believe me. There's been a lot of different situations where this has impacted deaf children, especially with sexual assault. An example here in Wisconsin is the St. John School for the Deaf. It's in Milwaukee. There was a lot of molestation done to deaf children, primarily boys, at that school by the priest, and it was a terrible situation at St. John School for the Deaf. There is a film, you have it on your screen, called Mea Maxima Culpa, Silence in the House of God. And that film, it's a documentary, it's a powerful story of grown men now who had experienced abuse when they were children at that school, and the inability to communicate what was going on, what was happening to them. And they didn't even really know it was wrong at the time, because their teachers were their trusted adults and they had power over these deaf children. And the teachers were the ones communicating with parents because they were both could speak English. So often these children could not communicate with their parents. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but a high percentage of hearing parents do not communicate with their deaf children. They don't know sign language. So that is a huge contributing factor to this issue of children experiencing sexual assault at such a high rate in the deaf community. So a recommendation for you would be to definitely watch that film. I think it would be a great learning experience for all of you. It explores some of the layers of oppression and trauma, systematic barriers that these individuals faced. If any more questions as we're going through this? Doesn't look like it, okay. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the power and control wheel. Of course, we're all familiar with the power and control wheel. With deaf victims that we talk to, we add a little bit to the wheel, especially in regards to oppression. We talk about intimidation, the withholding of information by the abuser, or threats such as, if you do this, I will hear you. If you try to escape, I'll hear you. And a deaf victim would feel that they couldn't escape because of maybe their partner's ability to hear. Emotional abuse is something I mentioned earlier. If the deaf individual feels bad about themselves and about them being deaf, that will affect if their abuser is using that over them. Isolation is another one. And from my perspective, I feel like that is a really even more severe factor for a deaf person, because they don't know what's going on. So if that deaf person is removed from their deaf community, from their deaf friends, and they have to stay at home where they don't have access to information, they don't have access to radio, if the TV is taken away or closed captions aren't provided, there's really, that abuser can have all the power and control over what that person accesses as far as information, and that's pretty serious. Maybe the deaf person is out in the community and they go to a community event or church, lots of different things, and a deaf person is there, but they don't have access to communication or what's going on because there's no interpreter. So if their abuser is putting them in primarily hearing-centric situations, they don't have access to information. And that can be isolating, even though they're out in the community, but it's the hearing community and they don't have access. Another one is using children and family against them, like I mentioned before. When you bring in an interpreter, it may not be fair to that person, because if you're using a family member or someone in the situation as the interpreter, they have control of the information. So they may withhold, they may give the wrong information to the victim, or the abuser could use the children in the situation as a way to threaten the victim, threaten their partner. They could say, if you don't do such and such, I will not let you teach the children sign language, so they can't communicate with you, and that's a big deal. Economic abuse is pretty severe in the deaf community as well. We see stories of this over and over and over, where the deaf person is taken advantage of by the perpetrator financially. And often there's a lack of knowledge system-wise, like how system works, how to set up a bank account. So the perpetrator or the abuser will use that power and privilege to financially exploit the deaf person. They may be taking their Social Security benefits. If there's a young adult who is 18 or 19 years old, sometimes an abuser will keep them home because they want to take advantage of those Social Security benefits for themselves. Coercion and threats, maybe forcing them to use a specific interpreter. They may say, you only get to use me as the interpreter. We're not going to hire an outside interpreter, because they don't want them having access to other people who can sign and who would be able to communicate for them, so they take on that role. And there's a lot of seemingly simple examples of this, like where an abuser will say, well, I know what's best, so I'm going to do X, Y, and Z for you, and that kind of stuff builds up. And I'm happy to go in depth in any particular situations or concepts that you're seeing in your programs that you're not really sure how to address, or what that could look like in your program or agency. If you're suspecting that there's a person experiencing this kind of thing, we'd be happy to talk with you, because there's so many different layers of oppression, so many layers of power and control that deaf victims experience, and sometimes they don't even realize it's there. And that's what we at Deaf Unity are here. We're here to help you unpack those kind of things and those kind of situations. Deaf Unity provides a number of services. I'm going to go into more of what we provide. We provide services for both individuals and agency and programs such as yours. We make sure that certain issues, especially with barriers and oppression, we work with agencies and individuals on how to address those barriers. Because a lot of different and unique situations and barriers come up in agencies and individuals' lives that we can help address. For example, we had a sexual assault situation at a hospital, and the hospital brought in a sign language interpreter, which was great, but they didn't realize that the interpreter was not able to sign clear enough or understand what was going on enough to explain it to the deaf victim. So the victim understood that they had been taken advantage of, but they did not understand the word rape. They did not understand what that concept was. And they kept saying over and over that they weren't raped. But it was very obvious by the deaf person explaining the situation that they were raped, but that English word rape, they did not understand what it meant and did not think it happened to them. So that's where Deaf Unity comes in, as often victims don't connect sexual assault with rape, because there's not enough information out there. So fortunately, a Deaf Unity advocate was there and was able to explain to that deaf person what rape meant and that whole concept, and was able to ask the deaf victim, do you feel comfortable with this interpreter, or would you prefer someone else? And the victim was able to say, I don't understand the interpreter, I need more explanation. So they were able to bring in a CDI, a certified deaf interpreter, because we recognized that there was a communication issue there, that the victim was not understanding And again, this interpreter was very skilled, was a hearing ASL interpreter, but needed more support. So we brought in the CDI, and they were able to make that happen. And it was because of this deaf person's education, language access. There was a lot of extenuating factors with this deaf person where they needed a fix now. They needed a help now to help them through this process. So we were able to help it go through the SANE exam, and there was a lot more understanding because we brought in the CDI, and it really helped this victim understand the process, understand the effects of trauma, to start the path to healing, to navigate the systems that was needed to go to court, to file a restraining order, that kind of thing. And that's what Deaf Unity can do to support the victim. We also at Deaf Unity work with programs as co-advocates, and we work with different programs, whether it is pressing charges, whether it's going with the victim to get a restraining order, whether it's access to a legal advocate. What we do is we recognize where are the barriers for this deaf victim getting resources, and we provide that extra explanation the victim needs. We talk to different systems. We talk through what the process looks like for this deaf victim, and we help them work with other hearing people while they navigate through all these systems. Another situation that happened, it was a homicide situation, and there was a victim of a homicide, and this person was reacting with the police and was really signing not very clearly, and was signing a little bit what would be perceived as angry, and it was perceived by the police because of how they were signing that they were the ones that had committed the homicide. But because Deaf Unity was there, we were able to work with the police officers and explain the nuances of the language, explain the trauma this person had experienced, and just were able to work with the police department saying we need to step back, and we worked with the police officer to help them understand what the best way to work with this deaf person was. We talked about potentially bringing in a CDI, bringing in an interpreter, and we said, this isn't going to be a 1-hour interview. This is going to be at least 3 hours. And, these are the kind of questions you need to ask. This is where potential gaps of this person's understanding is. And the police department was able to incorporate that. So the deaf person was able to tell their story as it related to this homicide. So Deaf Unity was able to work in that situation as well.
There's another really touching story. There was an agency that contacted us and said that there was a deaf person coming for a meeting and asked if we could come and assist. So we did. We sent an advocate, a deaf advocate, and the meeting took place, and the person, they're a deaf person. They use a cochlear implant, but they also signed, and still they faced a lot of barriers in communication and access. So this meeting went on, and Deaf Unity was present and a deaf advocate there. And they realized that there were many misunderstandings that had happened in their stories with police and other people involved as they went through the story. So the deaf person was clarifying, and our advocate just put in, wanted to show concern for what was going on in the situation. So the deaf person said, wow, it's really good that you have a voice in this and that you're sharing your story. And the deaf person just broke down and cried, and it was quite apparent that all these misunderstandings, it was the first time that the deaf person really felt heard, having another deaf person there who understood what was going on. So it was important for them to have a voice to be able to tell their story in sign language, to be able to tell their story, have a deaf person see it, be understood fully. And it was such a sense of relief for them. And they felt so appreciated that they just broke down. So sometimes it can make a big difference to bring along a person who understands the oppression, who understands the trauma, all the layers of barriers that they've faced their whole life in having to engage with systems. So that's why we really encourage you to involve Deaf Unity to help break down those barriers and help the deaf victim to know that there is someone that understands their experience.
And that's all I have for you all today. If you have any questions, please ask me. This is the perfect time. I thought I saw a question earlier, or a comment, I see. Programs need to provide captions for hard of deaf, hard of hearing? Is that a question? And also, okay, yes. As far as the captions, yes. If you have a TV in your shelter or anything like a TV in your public spaces, have the closed captions listed. And really, closed captions benefits everyone, not just folks who are deaf. The question is about accessing Deaf Unity. Oh, absolutely. Anyone can reach out to us at our hotline. It's help@deafunity.wi.org. The email address that you see on the screen now is for general questions and information, like where can I get an interpreter? How do I find an interpreter agency? Do you mind coming for a training? That's where you can reach out to us at that email address. But if you need an in-person, like an advocate, because there's someone in crisis and you need an immediate assistance, then it would be the help@deafunity.wi.org. And all of that information is online, and we will be emailing all of that information to you. It's also on the PowerPoint. All right, any other questions? Looks like no other questions, so I think we can wrap it up. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar today. We really appreciate it, and I hope that you were able to learn something from us today. Feel free to reach out to us if anything comes to mind later, any questions. If you need resources or support from Deaf Unity, we're happy to help. Again, it's at no charge to you. Thank you so much.